Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 7. We are approaching the halfway point of the course already, if you can believe it. This week, we're working on Unit 4, Lecture 2. I hope you all enjoyed the break from me last week. As a quick note before we get started, I just wanted to apologize for how late this lecture is coming out tonight. Sometimes at work, different tasks come up. So, for instance, mine today was, hey, you know that meeting that we were going to have with the division director maybe in 4 to 6 weeks? Yeah, it's happening tomorrow. So I was staying at work a little bit later trying to get some of those tasks wrapped up for a quick turnaround meeting. And I also wanted to make sure that I provided some additional feedback on the threaded discussions before getting into the lecture. So thank you for bearing with me this week as the lecture is posted a little bit late. But as always, let's jump into our review of last week. As you all recognized, I was not there. You're welcome. But in my place was Dan Pink from the TED Talk. And the whole purpose of that lecture was really to talk about the idea behind intrinsic motivation. And in particular, the 3 factors of autonomy, mastery, and purpose that managers can use to inspire their employees beyond more tangible rewards. So instead of using the proverbial stick or carrot, here are ways that you can really reinforce an employee's connection to the organization by giving them the freedom and the skills and the trust to get their job done. What's been interesting in reading through the discussions this week is that not everyone bought into the idea. That's perfectly okay. That's what these lectures are designed to do. And so I've really been inspired by the types of comments and discussions that you all are engaging in. And because of the TED Talk, we didn't have a lecture on the T&B chapters 11 and 12 that covered human resource management and theories of employee motivation. But I thought for the most part, those chapters were actually pretty driven by different techniques and strategies that you can employ in practice. And because of that, I think the readings really resonated a lot more with you all, and I saw that exemplified through the discussions. So as always, if there's anything that you want to return to from those chapters in the discussions, feel free to shoot me a note. I'm happy to talk about them, but I really thought you all demonstrated a mastery of the ideas that were presented in those chapters. So thank you for that. Thank you for your continued engagement. So let's jump right in. So our main theme for this unit is nonprofit leadership. And so we started that discussion last week with human resource management, which is quite simply the management of people, and then theories of motivation. So is it that employees are motivated intrinsically? Is it extrinsically? How much of this is dependent on the type of organization in which one finds themselves? How much of it is driven by an employee's personality traits and what they're more apt to respond to? And how much of it is really determined by an individual's leadership style. And so leadership through the Nordhaus chapters, in particular, chapter 3, which was the skills approach, and chapter 9, which was transformational leadership, are what I want to dive into today. And again, I've already seen some great discussions on these, so I think for the most part, these themes were really applicable and understood by all of you, but I do want to just provide kind of a quick review of these chapters. So the first is that the skills approach really was a response to an earlier model called a trait-based theory of leadership. And in a nutshell, the trait-based approach really says that whether leaders are successful or not is dependent upon that leader's innate characteristics. It's the idea that you're either born with certain attributes or you're not. And if you don't have them, then you're SOL. You're just not going to succeed in a leadership environment. The skills approach adapted that model. They said, hey, wait a minute. There are certain attributes that individuals possess regardless of experience, but that there are a host of other characteristics that really can be cultivated and developed through one's professional and personal pursuits that can help develop better leaders. So even if you're not born with a set of characteristics that are supposed to predict whether or not you'll be successful as a leader, there are certain skills that you can learn on the job to improve the likelihood of success, both for you in that leadership position and for your organization as a whole. And so the early model that came out of this was what the book emphasized as the 3 skills approach. And so this really emphasized the components of technical, human, and conceptual skills. And I thought where the book did a nice job in particular was really presenting that tier of management, where in particular at lower levels of management, technical skills are valued. And this intuitively makes sense. You need employees that are closer to the groundwork, who know the ins and outs of the organization. But as you move up the rungs of the ladder into higher levels, you also need people who can identify the big picture. What is the long-term mission of the organization? What are the goals? How do we achieve those holistically or systematically? That's the conceptual element. And then the human element is, how well do you work with people? Because ultimately, if you're someone who's not driven by a desire to respond to someone else's needs or interactions or something that make you more uncomfortable, then it might be challenging at those top levels of management positions where so much of your work is driven by that interaction. You're coordinating with other divisions, with other managers, with more closely with the board of directors, or, you know, if you're a manager working with the ED, and then you're going to go back down to your employees. So when we take these 3 sets of attributes together, we get a better impression of what the skills approach really is. But again, the underlying emphasis here is that these skills can be cultivated. They're not innate or not. Out of that 3 skills approach, we saw some progression in the ideas that made the model a little more complicated. So in particular, the model as it evolved really came to embrace a combination of individual attributes, which are more of that trait-based approach, cognitive reasoning, motivation, things of that nature. Competencies, which really, as the book states, are the heart and soul of the skills model, and then outcomes. And ultimately what this produces is a pretty conceptual model that says, how do individual attributes, competencies, together with work experience and environmental conditions, relate to outcomes? Now, one of the criticisms of this model, and I'm jumping the points here a little bit, but is that it really is descriptive. There isn't predictive utility. And what that means in a nutshell is that it's not saying if individual attributes are really high and competencies are really low, we therefore expect to see lower levels of outcomes. We might think that that's the case, but there's really nothing to demonstrate that some characteristics or some combination of these sets of characteristics are going to be more successful than others. The question I always pose in response to a criticism like that is why does it matter? I am of the philosophy, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me on this in the lecture, that we need a basic understanding of the descriptive environment first. That is to say, we cannot get to the place of predicting how outcomes will or will not be achieved until we have a better sense of the factors that influence or are thought to influence the achievement of those outcomes. So I actually think the skills-based approach is actually quite useful for distilling some of these complex ideas about organizational behavior, human behavior, patterns of management interaction that are thought to interact on their way to affecting outcomes. So a little early food for thought there. The other criticism that was really presented in regards to the skills-based approach is what I would summarize as power and parsimony. Now, in the academic world, we think of a good theory as having these 2 elements. Power refers to how much can the theory actually explain, and parsimony is to what extent can the theory do that with a limited number of variables. And this is an important combination because you want a theory that's broad enough that it can be applied across a variety of contexts. For instance, in the skills-based approach, we don't see this as being limited to just nonprofit organizations or just corporate entities or just government. It's reasonable to assume that this is applicable to a number of different contexts. But at the same time, the more things that the theory tries to explain, the more it runs the risk of explaining everything, which in the research world means it explains nothing. So what does it not explain? And that's where the skills approach has struggled with parsimony in its endeavor to become really complex and really robust. it sacrificed a little bit of that specificity. But as we move in now to the transformational leadership, we're going to notice a similar criticism levied against this perspective as well. But before we get into that, the first distinction that the book makes, and I think, again, it does a nice job of kind of reiterating that theme throughout the chapter, is this idea of transactional versus transformational leadership. So the idea of transactional versus transformational leadership really can be, I think, distinguished on the concept of management versus leadership. So when we think of the word management, we're typically thinking of doing things right. And when we think of leadership, we think of doing the right things. And so transactional leadership is more of that perfunctory, performance-based measurement, and not really a lot of creativity or inspiration that necessarily goes into that style of engagement with employees. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, really embraces a host of characteristics and attributes that inspire followers. So among the many different attributes that are presented in this chapter, some of the most important are the concepts of charisma, inspiration, competence, meaning that your employees see you as having the skills necessary or that are requisite of the position, inspiring trust within your employees, having a broad-reaching vision about what the organization is and where it aims to go. And in encompassing all of these different factors, a transformational leader really seeks to inspire their followers. So again, it deviates from that more traditional model of management that for so long was emphasized both in the research and in practice on that transactional lens. And one of the best ways I thought the book presented it was actually just on that continuum, where on the left-hand side you had transformational leadership, you had transactional in the middle, and then you had laissez-faire leadership all the way on the left. And laissez-faire is just the idea of hands off. I'm going to let people do what they need to do, and I'm going to have faith that they will do those jobs to expectation. But the book also mentioned that there were some dangers of transformational leadership, particularly when the elements of charisma get in the wrong hands. They use the example of Hitler. You can't really come up with a better example than Hitler for this concept of pseudo-transformational leadership. But those are some of the dangers that go along when you have anything that involves the word leader and follower in its description. Now, the way I posed the question that was a similar criticism to the skills approach, which was framed in that slide as power versus parsimony, then becomes in this slide the issue of what is transformational leadership not? Well, okay, we know that it's not your standard run-of-the-mill approach to management, but if a leader is expected to embrace all of these different characteristics, one, is that reasonable? Can someone have all of these characteristics? Can you have transformational leadership in the absence of these things? And then, because there are so many components, how do you successfully determine whether someone actually is embodying the idea of transformational leadership, particularly if these different competencies are employed to different degrees? The other criticism that we see in the transformational leadership approach is the question of, is it trait-based? And as I mentioned in the skills approach, something that style of leadership or that theory of leadership really was trying to move away from was the idea that you had to be born with certain characteristics. It's really considered an antiquated model and has largely been disproved in the scientific community. Transformational leadership, although it's a relatively newer theory and it's been gaining a lot of traction, right? It's inspiring. You want to get out there and you want to use that charisma and use those skill sets to get your employees to work in pursuit of the mission. To what extent are these things trait-based? One of these times I'm going to get that word together. Trait-based. I'll work on it. But in the meantime, how much of these things can be taught? It was a criticism that was levied at the end of the chapter. It's not something that I want to provide an answer on for you all. I'd like you to think about it. which elements of this theory do you think come from someone's innate characteristics, and what of these competencies really can be cultivated? So if you all watch the lecture and get to this question, you don't have to answer it in the discussion, but I'd like to throw it out for you. So moving on, questions or food for thought. So the first question I have, because we examined two leadership styles and the way that those are juxtaposed, is, are these two styles mutually exclusive? I asked, and it perhaps was in the way that I framed one of the discussion questions this week, was which one resonates more with you, skills or transformational? And I think to some extent that's actually a fair question. There will be elements that just make more sense to you, either through your own experience or through your own personality preferences. So it's not a surprise to me that one would be favored over the other. But that being said, can you display elements of both? Have you seen managers in your work environments display some attributes of the skills approach and some attributes of the transformational style? So if we kind of expand that question, the next one that comes out of it is, how might you adapt your style of leadership within different organizational settings or with different employees? If you're in an organization that is more hierarchical, less entrepreneurial, is it more appropriate to use the skills-based approach because it functions better within those organizational constraints? Or do you say, well, hold on, wait a minute, we have enough natural constraint in this organizational setting that maybe now's the time to emphasize that transformational approach that really inspires employees beyond feeling like the proverbial cog in the machine. So to what extent do you find that adapting that style is appropriate and is context dependent? Which segues into the third question, which are, what are the advantages of adjusting your leadership style? I mean, certainly one of the things we might anticipate almost immediately is the responsivity of employees. You might have an employee who really needs that motivational element, that transformational piece. You might have another employee who actually does better from more standard types of performance reviews or feedback that are skills related, just based on their personality preferences. So adaptability might be a very important characteristic. But could there be disadvantages to adapting your style? What if you pick a moment to adapt the style and it's not appropriate to that setting? What if you are displaying, say, transformational leadership with one employee because that's, preferred, and you're working off the assumption that a skills-based approach is more appropriate with another employee? Does that disrupt perceptions of fairness or equity? So again, just some big picture questions. Think through those. The application this week, I wanted to have a little bit of fun. I know that's why the discussion questions were designed to be more creative. So I just wanted to give you all a breakdown of the tests that I took at the end of the chapters. So the skills approach, I scored a 26 on the technical, 25 on the conceptual, so those were pretty closely related, and sadly a 15 on the human skill. According to the book, that means I'm probably well suited to middle level management if that's a career that I decide to pursue. But more importantly, it gave me a moment of introspection to say, okay, on the job, the way I think about ideas tends to be either big picture creative or more of this logical, rational choice, a bit of a tinkerer. And so the human interaction isn't as big of a component for me. And so that's something that certainly at a minimum I need to be aware of, and hopefully more proactively work to improve. And interestingly enough, I think it was in Group B, I mentioned the idea in my organization that we use something called the color test to determine personalities. And the general idea behind it is that in professional environments, people are going to display attributes to different degrees, and they're represented through colors. So for instance, there are 4. Blue, if you're mostly blue, it means that you're driven by intuition, feeling, human interaction. If you're gold, it means you're really driven by following rules and procedure. If you're orange, it means you're more outgoing and sarcastic, and you liven up interactions in that way. And if you're green, you're really driven by logic and empirics. And so when I took the test, I scored the minimum that was allowed possible for blue. I'm not driven by feelings. It's not to say that I don't have them. I do have more than happy and sad. We're all kind of complex that way. But it is to say that in a professional environment, my style of communication, of problem solving, and of leadership really is driven by what is the problem at hand and how do we solve that problem. So I am the embodiment of a green, but it actually is a nice complement to the assessment that was provided in the skills-based approach, which basically indicated that my weakest area was human skill. So they actually complement each other quite nicely, which is a very ad hoc way to assess the validity of the skills instrument that was presented. And then in the transformational chapter, we had the condensed version of the MLQ. And so I scored 4, 4, and then 2. So I was transformational with the exception of individualized consideration, which again reinforces the fact that I don't excel particularly well at human skills. And then I also scored, I think those were on 4s as well, 4 and 4 on the transactional approach, because I do tend to be more task oriented, and I was not an avoidant style of leadership. I'm certainly not laissez-faire. So anyhow, I just wanted to give you all a little bit of insight about me, just to kind of break it up, and also because both chapters I thought did a nice job with presenting 3 case studies as examples of application. So I thought the book really handled the application piece. So now you can learn a little bit more about me, and hopefully some of the rest of you will be interested in providing me answers to your assessments if you opt to take the tests at the end of the chapters. So let's wrap up. We'll keep the lecture a little bit short this week, to the extent that I can keep things short, which really is not very. But anyhow, we are moving into week 8. We are starting unit 5 next week, which is part 1 of a bigger discussion on nonprofit survival. We have a short reading assignment for next week. It's just 1 chapter from TNB, and it's on resource acquisition. And the reason is because you'll be working on your journal article analysis. So just a reminder that analysis will be due a week from Sunday, so Sunday, March 12th. And if you do opt to use an article that's outside of the 5 that are pre-selected, please get that selection to me for approval by this Sunday. So anyhow, I'm going to keep it short and just say thank you all. I look forward to seeing you next week. I will do my best to integrate the TED Talks more. I think a lot of you responded quite well to that, so we'll mix up the lecture format throughout the remainder of the course. And I look forward to seeing how the rest of your discussions for Unit 4 unfold over the weekend. So take care and see you next week.